Brought to you by the Rugby Outlet Mall, equipping you for freedom and connection through rugby. Find out more at rugbyoutletmall.com. Welcome, everybody, to another great episode of Greaux Rugby. My name is GiftTime and this is the podcast where we get to speak with people who have found, created, taken advantage, or been able to determine opportunities that come via rugby and the stories that they have to tell about it. Yo, we got a great guest for you today. Farrah Douglas. This was one of my favorite conversations, and this isn't even to say none of them are, but this was one of my favorite because this was such a uniquely different conversation on the usage of rugby. And while typically we usually go kind of an origin story and we wind it in, this one became much more of a metaphysical, philosophical story, and this was interesting to me. And it's a longie and a goodie. Can't deny that. It is a longie, but it is a goodie. That is just it's a great precept from one's internal identification journey to how it relates to the field itself. So just so you guys know, Farrah Douglas, she is the head coach over at Mount St. Mary's College up in Emmitsburg, Maryland. I'm sorry, correct that. Mount St. Mary's University, not college. Mount St. Mary's University at Emmitsburg, Maryland. Yeah, I got it written down, so I got to be able to see it. But she has been a USA Rugby development coach. She has been a USA Rugby national player. She has been in this game, and she is as inquisitive as she is skilled, as she is kind, as she is insightful. This was really interesting. So I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. And of course, don't forget, we all get to do this because, Rugby Outlet Mall, man, definitely go check it out. We're getting ready to put some new products, and we got some new stuff starting to come in, but we got some great things to be able to connect you with the rugby community, connect people together, obviously supporting HBCU Rugby Classic and HBCU Rugby programs, and of course the novelty rugby stuff that we have in set and merch, including foods, little bit of gear, and novelty things that are great for travel and mobility, because this is all about opportunity and mobility and providing the equipment for that. So you guys check it out, rugbyoutletmall.com, and you guys can use coupon code GREAUX, GREAUX rugby, to be able to get 20% off all GTRN or HBCU Rugby Classic specific merchandise. So you guys enjoyed it. And also definitely go check out Singapore to Tokyo any way we can. The documentary still streaming now on video on demand and streaming. Guys, it's a great documentary, even more relevant now, especially as we are having to keep separating ourselves more and more. But to get to see the way that the world works, and the world works via rugby, this is definitely the experience to be able to take it, as these two men go through Southeast Asia to head over to the Rugby World Cup 2019. You guys are going to want to be part of this exhilarating journey, and you guys can go find it at redearthfilms.vhx.tv. That's redearthfilms.vhx.tv. And check it out. It is a 7-episode, 20-minute per episode journey. You guys can watch it fractionally over time, but it will be well worth the money. So you guys, thank you. And I'm not even going to hold you guys off much longer. Great guest, Farrah Douglas. Enjoy.
Grow rugby, grow rugby, grow rugby, grow rugby, grow rugby, grow rugby, grow rugby.
Welcome, everybody, to another great episode of Grow Rugby. I got another VIP guest for us today, coming out of Mount St. Mary's, women's head coach, Farrah Douglas, the legend. I don't think you guys even realize how much so Farrah, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this.
You know, I have to say, one of the earliest times that I got to know you or I get to see who you were was actually because of Roots Rugby. And I think it was the interconnection through the group. And then I started hearing your name pop up more and more around the networks. And then I started looking up. I'm like, I was like, okay, she's a head coach for here. And then you start looking at your resume and you're like, oh my gosh, you've been in the game for you've been doing in the game for a minute, like getting it through. And I'm like, wait, I need to get to know who this person is a lot more. So I have to say, like, you have really kind of clicked in on this hard. For you, like, was this always something that felt like a calling, or like is being in the coaching realm and really in this youth development realm, is this felt like a calling for you, or how did that shape out for you?
Well, I think the minute I stepped on a practice field for rugby, the calling happened. But I think it was probably a year after I graduated from Bowdoin that I realized that this was like a passionate obsession and that rugby was going to be a part of me forever. The coaching piece, I think, just is something that I naturally fell into because at heart, I'm an educator. I spent about 5 years working in youth development while I was living in Chicago. And within that job, I was a director for an after-school program, as well as running youth and family outreach for a very, very small local nonprofit to Chicago that sort of operated like a small scale version of like Boys and Girls Club of America.
Right.
And then when I came to the DC area, I spent 3 years actually in education teaching. I did a year as an assistant teacher in an autistic preschool class. It was a pilot program in DC public schools. And then I spent 2 years in a charter school system as an assistant teacher in kindergarten.
So you really have been, it has been a grassroots from across the board where you've always started trying to develop from the beginning on.
Yeah. I spent the greater portion of my coaching has been like grassroots youth level. When I was living in Chicago, there was a local school called Noble Street, which now runs a multi-campus school that has rugby on all of its campuses, and they compete within like sort of a school league, so to speak. It's been some time since I've been a part of that. Clearly, I left Chicago in 2009, but in 2004 was my first coaching experience in rugby.
Nice.
I worked with Nobi Takaki, who is a Chicago North Shore player, which was my women's club side at that time, and former Eagle and teammate Pam Kosenki, and the three of us worked together to coach that program. And which is kind of amazing because, you know, that just started as like this one team in Chicago at the inner city school that was like near like a park with a not so great neighborhood, and it has morphed into this, you know, public school with like multiple campuses and multiple teams for both boys and girls. And to imagine that girls were signing up for it as a class elective, and we were practicing at 7 o'clock in the morning outside, and where rugby for the school program has come, and just in general where the game is, especially for women, is pretty cool. And to be able to reflect back that my first rugby coaching experience, I was very much still a player, and was 2004, and it's 2020, and I'm an NCAA head coach. Like,
the rate.
If you had told me I would have a career as a coach, I would have laughed at you. Like, what are you talking about?
But it shows such a trademark to the consistency, and as well as the hard work that goes into it, because eventually you start to see it's weird. You watch these things kind of almost reveal themselves. It almost attracts into it after a little bit. It no longer becomes you're working towards this. It's like, oh, I've been trying to put out this value, this energy, this this assistance out there, and all of a sudden things kind of start to develop around it, and you find yourself in a place where you didn't see it from the beginning, and then you find yourself here, and you're like, this makes sense, but wow, the journey has been unique.
Yes, very much so.
So I want to ask, because I want to go kind of start from the beginning on this, because in that just alone, there's so much to be able to delve into. But I want to go from how did you actually get started in rugby itself?
Oh, it's kind of I think of it as like a funny story. So I started sports when I was 10 years old. I danced for a very long time. So you would think I'm graceful. I am not. And when I swapped into sports, it was the typical sports that girls grow up playing. Right. Volleyball, soccer, basketball. Fast forward into high school, my freshman year of high school, I was a basketball and soccer athlete, and I swapped schools, and they did not have a girls' soccer team, but you could try out for the boys' team. And I was still in that awkward phase. When I played youth soccer, I was a little heavyset. I wore glasses with sport bands, and my glasses were way too large for my face. And, I had that awful 80s style. I used to wear the biker shorts with the crop top, and I'd pull all my hair back as tight as I could and slick that back into this big poofy ponytail. And then I would flat iron and curl my bangs. It looked like I was on a motorcycle that had gone through a wind tunnel. I go back and look at those pictures, and I'm like, oh God. So I was just a huge package of athletic awkwardness. Right. I was an athlete, but I was this chubby girl with weird hairstyle and an even awkwarder style of fashion sense. So boys picked on me because there weren't a lot of girls. Right. I was maybe one of two, and there most definitely weren't a lot of faces like mine. So I got picked on a lot, and I had two older brothers, an older sister, and a younger brother. So,
oh wow,
responding in aggression was not necessarily something I was not accustomed to. I could only play the first and last quarter of basketball because I would foul out.
Look, you had to set your dominance somehow within the family early.
Yeah. And so with soccer, I learned to be physical, because if I didn't, they would single me out. Right. So, you get to high school, and all of a sudden boys are a little less gross. Mm-hmm. And now I'm going through a second phase of sort of adolescent growth and feeling even less secure in my being. So when they told me I could try out for the boys soccer team, I was like, yeah, no.
It was a strong time. I was too many awkward levels that were going to be happening at the same time.
Just the crossing of everything, and when I reflect back on it, I wish I had not made that decision, because I really enjoyed soccer and was, I think, a fairly decent soccer player. But it opened other doors.
Well, so quick question, even on that, you're talking about soccer that's happening in the 80s and 90s at that point. So it's not even at its hot moments like it is now. No. So you already have that isolation, that already isolation of you're a soccer person in a very not soccer kind of area.
Yeah. I mean, I think in my childhood around sports, you have two things intersecting. I'm mixed. Right. My mother raised me as a single mom, and she's white. So traditionally the areas that we lived in were very middle class, very not diverse. Right. The high school I ended up graduating from, I want to say, had probably a little bit stronger of a Hispanic population because of the location. But in general, there weren't a lot of faces of color. And you're talking about a public high school where we had an indoor track, an outdoor track, a hockey rink, they paid for AP exams, and it's not a she school by any means, but that's the type of environment. So then you add that I'm a girl,
Right.
and I'm athletic. And I think, in that time, in like 80s and like early 90s, like women's professional sports were sort of like this whisper. Like when I played basketball, like I used to tell my dad, I'm going to be the first female in the NBA. Like, and you flash back to now, I'm 43 and there's a WNBA.
Right.
But at that time, when I was in middle school,
Not even a thought process that would have been.
No, and nobody would have corrected me to say there'll be a women's professional league by the time you're an adult.
Right.
Like, we didn't have those conversations. So it was like this intersecting of being this awkward girl, playing sports, being aggressive, trying to find a way to express myself, because dance was fun, but I didn't like dance.
It didn't fulfill.
It wasn't my thing. Yeah.
Didn't fulfill that itch right there.
And then, not only being a girl, but then being on these teams where you look around and there are no other brown faces. There are no other people of color playing. When I started playing a little bit older basketball, and one of my dad's cousins was my coach, it was the first time that someone looked like me.
Wow.
So it was like, wow.
And that was by high school time that you had got.
No, that was that would have been probably 5th, 6th grade.
Okay. Right at that perfect time where development is just starting to kick in. So wow. So I can imagine already where, again, we talk about the multiple layers of awkward that was already going to be entering into that phase, and especially at the high school level, when now outside, on top of what's just like, okay, I got to deal with this from a personal level. Now you have your own emotions, and you're starting to take in your surroundings in a much more self-aware environment, like the high school environment creates.
Yep. So I declined soccer. The cross-country coach was, kind of like skeeving around, like, I need to find some athletes. And I don't know how she got my contact information, but I got this phone call that was like, introduced herself, asked if I would be interested in coming out for the team. And I said, what's cross-country?
Right.
And she said, well, it's distance running. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, you run 3 miles. And like, I used to do this thing called the Walk for Hunger with my aunt. And so in my head, I would calculate. I was like, I can walk 20 miles. Like, I should be able to run 3. So I said, sure. And I think the first practice I showed up to, they were doing like 600-meter hill sprints. I was like, what did I just do? But I'm not a quitter. So if I commit to something, regardless of whether I feel miserable or not, like, I will see it to end. So I did not enjoy that first practice, but I stayed and captained the team my senior year.
Nice.
I run a lot now post retirement from rugby, but it's funny because it's
player retirement. There's never a true retirement from rugby.
Well, yes. Okay. I will rephrase that. My player retirement. But as a cross country runner, I used to drive my coach crazy because a competitive person in me could not control. So like, I always managed to keep myself in the top 7 for finishes for our team.
Nice.
But the gun would go off and I'd be like, oh yeah. And I'd take off running. And I still had those glasses because I didn't get my contacts until I think my junior or senior year of high school. So I'd have the sport band, these glasses, and I'd slick the hair back and then have this huge bun on the top of my head. And I would rabbit the race. So you'd see the whole field and there'd be me in front of everybody.
Right.
Like, hell yeah, I got this. And then slower and slower and slower. And then I call it now buffalo hunting, but I would find someone in the race who was not a fast person. And then I would run with them. And then the last like 800 to 400 meters, I'd be like, peace.
Sure.
And then,
Stop it.
and then
Stop
and then I'd be out. And my coach used to be like, Farrah, if you would just pace yourself, do you know how good you could potentially be? And I'd just shrug my shoulders and be like, okay. And like, I get it now, but at the time, I didn't really like have a concept.
Right, because you're seeing it from the back end up. Because for you, again, it sounds like between the competitiveness that comes from soccer, sports, and family, it's look, let me kill it early, and then I'm just gonna get my body. But as long as I finish strong, like we're gonna win. We got this. Like, what's the big deal? I'm finishing strong.
Yep.
Oh.
So I did cross country, and because I did cross country, and the high school I was at, I had cousins who had gone to school there previously, and the indoor track coach approached me about coming out for track during the cross country season, because the spring track coach was a cross country coach, so that was done. Like, I wasn't getting out of that.
I was about to ask, if you were so quick off the bat for early marathons, especially within that first 800, I was gonna say, why didn't nobody come talk to you about track? That sounds like a perfect setup for an 800 meter minimum, and let alone a 400 relay.
For volleyball. Why? Yeah. So, well, I'm very much like my rugby career. I'm a tweener. So I did indoor and outdoor track, but originally the indoor track coach reached out to me because my cousins were throwers.
Ah, I see.
So he made the assumption that I might be genetically gifted for throwing, much like my family members. Yeah. So I said, sure, because I wasn't going to play basketball anymore. I had done JV basketball my freshman year, swapped schools. There was some politics going on with, parents and whatnot. And I just not feeling this. Yeah. So, and I did discover that I really did enjoy cross country. So I said, why not? But at that time, I'm not quite a sprinter, and I wasn't quite a distance runner. Right. So I pretty much got thrown into everything. So I did the middle distances. In indoor, I ran the 300, the 400. I was on a 4x4. And the 1,000. I can't remember which. It was like 600 or 1,000. But essentially, I did those like middle distance one as well as shot put.
Nice.
And whenever we were short someone in high school for the 2 mile, in indoor, which is awful because it's just like laps and laps and laps, coach would say, Farrah, I need someone to run this 2 mile Saturday. You're in. And my eyes would just get big because, like the big workouts were like repeat 3s and 4s because I was a middle distance person. And I was, you just said, okay. So that was indoor. And then outdoor track, I did the shot put and discus, and then like middle distances. But the throwing coach that first year, which would have been my sophomore year, was also a football coach.
Oh, nice.
And he asked me to come out for football, and I was all about it. My mother was like, absolutely not. That was the end of that discussion.
Wait, hold on. So was it all about hitting because of like just like being able to be that second to youngest child and already knowing the roughness, or was it just because of the basis of what you had already said before? You're so used to having to learn how to deal with contact that you wanted just another area where you could level that contact with a lot less repercussions like you would get in soccer or even in basketball to some extent?
I think for me, it's a combination of that sort of having to kind of stand your ground.
Okay.
As well as I like contact.
Like this, I was born in. This is what I do. This is what I do.
Yeah, like it sounds like funny, but like I like contact, and I think one of the things that I discovered through track and field is that I have a very natural transfer of power,
Right.
which makes sense to me that like contact is something I enjoy, because that being able to transfer that like force through movement came fairly naturally to me. I think if I had maybe picked up something like wrestling when I was younger, I probably would have stayed in that space, because it would have been a place where I think all of the things that kind of brought me to rugby probably would have kept me there, and I may never have, crossed over into our sport.
That makes sense. Because when you were talking and you're talking about what you were doing with sports, especially the fact that you added that you did shot put and discus, it made me think that means you were probably a very strong lower body person, which means you probably have a lower center of gravity, which would make sense again when it comes down to your middle distance running, because you're able to maintain a pace, obviously endurance wise, but maintain a pace and speed that would make sense to that. And it makes sense with the soccer component of it, which I'd have to assume that maybe you're a midfielder for the most part.
I wish I could remember where I played.
I
remember in basketball, I was a center.
Okay.
Which is, yeah. So I got really good at like shooting from the top of the key. But I mean, it's been so long since I've played either sport. Shamefully, like once I discovered rugby, it was like, I'm sorry, what are those? Like, it was like the blinders came on.
What is this peons of sports that you speak of over here?
That's awful. But I've always stayed like, I don't know, like a part of me is always still kind of like in touch, clearly, because like I'm on like day 334 of my run streak with like track and field, because that's what I went to college for.
Right.
I was cross country, and then I did indoor and outdoor track, and I was a multi. So I did the heptathlon and the pentathlon when I was at Bowdoin. And by the time I graduated there, the only track and field events that I had not competed in were the triple jump, because we discovered I was not coordinated enough for that.
The dancers thing didn't help.
No, not at all. And what is it? The 400 meter hurdles. Okay. But every other event I did, because at that time we didn't have, there was no pole vault for girls. I'm pretty sure I probably would not have done pole vault because I'm bottom heavy. So trying to like flip myself over that. Probably, yeah, probably. So we can count that in like, so 3 events I didn't participate in between high school and collegiate track and field, which is kind of, I think it's kind of cool, because when I meet people and we talk about track and they're like, oh, well, what was your event? I said, well, what was it?
Everything. So wait, coming out of high school, were you highly sought after by universities, or was there a reason why Bowman became like the one that you ended up going to?
No, I was decent in like the throwing events. I just, like, to be honest, I don't think that I sort of like discovered like my athletic ability and what I could challenge myself to tap into until after high school. So Bowdoin was my choice of schools because at the time I wanted to be pre-med. Okay. And it was an agreeable distance away from home for my mom, because she could drive there if she wanted to. Thankfully, she never just showed up. And my mom is a nurse. Okay. 2 of her sisters are nurses, and my godmother, who's my mom's best friend, and they've been best friends since they were like 12, is also a nurse.
So it was supposed to be in the blood one way or another that you were going to do medical.
Yeah, and she just made me promise not to be a nurse. She said, just be a doctor, because you'll do the same things that a doctor does and not get paid as well. So I'd prefer you to go to medical school. And she spoke with the doctors that she worked with, and they actually recommended Bowdoin, said they had a really strong science program for a liberal arts school. And I went there to visit for like a student of color weekend and was like, this is amazing. I love it. Then I got there and I was like, where'd all the people of color go?
Wait. Where was the preview people that you showed me last time? Like what happened?
Yeah. I mean, the place looked super diverse because it was like this weekend where all of us came. And so it was like, oh my God, this is awesome. And it's a beautiful campus.
Right.
Then I showed up for freshman orientation and I was like, what happened? And I mean, I feel that, the crazy thing is that still happens. Where like, you kids show up to school and it's like,
I saw this differently. I thought this was gonna be another experience. It's like they turned the channel on you. They showed you the what do they call it? In like the hotels whenever it's like everything is tourists and everything going on.
Yeah.
And you go out and you're like,
the amenities.
this isn't as shiny as I thought it was supposed to be. Like, well, hold on, what changed over here?
Yeah. But like, it still was. It was still a good decision.
Right.
There was a lot of like learning that happened in behind the diverse factor of the school, but so I showed up to cross country and go back to that like awkward moment, and when you think about like your stereotypical distance runner, they
Right.
are thin.
Right. Like really skinny, really.
Yeah, they're skinny. They've got like elongated muscles. They tend to be a bit taller, but they're all look like they have 0% body fat, and
Right.
that even with all the running I do now, that is not me. I'm just not built for that. I am built for power.
Right.
So, and it took me a really long time to like sort of understand that about like how my body is sort of like put together, and how it exists in the world. So you come back to like my first year of college. It's the fall, just got to campus. I'm like, where'd all the people of color go? And I'm at cross country, which is
All right.
kind of white.
Right.
And I was the fat kid on the team. And I was slow relative to everyone else. So
because at that point you were better for 800s and 800s, 400s, and it's a different game.
So I was
32.
I was miserable. It just it was hot and humid in Maine, and like these girls were just super, super thin, and it was like that, and you'd like to say that like as an athlete you don't think about those things, but I did, and I looked around and nobody even remotely was built like me.
Right.
And I went in, saw Coach Slavinsky, and I just was like, yeah, I don't want to run. I'll see you at indoor track. So I quit, and they were recruiting in the dorm for rugby.
Wait, let me ask this, because you had said something before that you didn't like quitting things prior to. So in that moment, like the level of decision making that you had to go into that, like how much did it end up affecting what you did moving forward? Because there was this moment that it was, let's call it a challenge that you stepped away from versus all these other times where there's always been that awkwardness before. Like, what was that like for you as an athlete in that moment?
Like trying to kind of go back to that moment and that decision, I just was so unhappy. I mean, going back to high school and like running, when Coach would have her car and follow us for the fartleks, and she'd go park somewhere and you'd see her, and that's when you had to like pick up your pace and run as hard as you could because she started that timer, and she'd drive somewhere else and stop and wait. They were miserable. We were just like, oh, this is terrible. It sucks. But like, I never felt like I didn't belong in that space.
Right.
And I'm sure probably part of it also helped that like I was one of our top 7 runners. So
it's a reward factor that keeps getting kicked.
Yeah. So I'm still feeling like competitive. And then to come to Bowdoin, and, it's a D3 NESCAC school, and they have a very good track and field and cross country program there. Mm-hmm. And to all of a sudden not be able to compete and to physically feel out of place in a way that I couldn't compensate like feeling out of place as a little girl playing soccer with boys, you physically can compensate for that
Right.
space by making them know who you are.
Right.
And like the slide checking and
It's
getting
a dominant
multiple yellow cards. Yeah, like I could physically answer.
Right.
And then in cross country and college, I couldn't. I wasn't built the way I needed to be built, and didn't have the training or approach to the sport, to running in general, to find a space for me to feel comfortable and competitive in my skin, like in that environment. And yeah, it's the first time I just was like, I don't want to do this. So, but I'm thankful for it.
Because it adds another layer of data and understanding.
Yeah, which I use now in my running, but I think it's also why I weathered through burnout when I experienced it as a player, and probably why I was so gung-ho about rugby because once that bug bit me, there's no turning back. And I never would have found it had I suffered through that season of cross country. So, it was club at the time. So they, flyer the dorms, they go around, and inevitably you probably know somebody who has played or know someone that played, like you're 6 degrees of separation. Right. So I got asked to go to practice. Never heard of it before. I said, what is it? I was told it was a cross between soccer and football, which
the common.
Yeah, and in certain degrees it is, and it's an easy way to explain it to like the layman. And I said, football. Ooh. My mom would probably hate this. Sure, I'll go to practice. And they were doing contact that first day, and I was like, oh my God, I have hit the MF jackpot. My mom is going to hate this. Yes, I am in. And that was it. Like, there was no coming back. Coming back.
It's interesting because you're now still talking about at this moment, like now we have so much more insight into women's rugby. There's so much more developed, still a long way, still ways to go to where it should be, but far further than where it was, and particularly for that time. And this was early 90s or so, correct?
Early mid-90s? This would have been 94? 94? 94? Yeah.
So you're right at that early stage. So there's kind of two parts that I keep kind of noticing here of constantly entering and loving these super awkward moments that make you uniquely characterized, while also simultaneously like also emblemating these characteristics that sometimes don't get churned naturally, and then you get to open them up and it's like just revealing it, like for you, is that been kind of like this game process? Because for you in discovering kind of a self in this, rugby created another variation of a self realization. Cross country in high school created kind of a self-realization. Having to switch out from soccer was a self-realization. There's these awkward moments that just open up these new doors for you. Would that be an accurate way of maybe looking at it?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good way to explain it. It's funny that you say that, because in my head, the intellectual nerd that exists in there is going, yeah, because so I was a science major, and I eventually swapped over to a double major in English and African American studies. Mm-hmm. And I went to grad school for a bit for English literature, and then quite a bunch of times for the rugby bug. But one of the things that I've always been fascinated with is identity, because it's very much performative. And, I think there's probably some core thread that constitutes who we are, if you will, if you want to get an aura or whatever it is. But like, I very much think that, yes, what I didn't realize what was happening to me with all of those doors opening and closing and going in one, back out to the other, and kind of like shifting around, is that I was discovering that who I am as a person in the world very much is going to adjust and mold based on what was in front of me, the
Right.
environment that I was in, whoever I was dealing with, very like contextual, if you will. And so I think that what sports did for me was open up this knowledge that it took me a really long time to actually be able to articulate that was what was happening, is that who Farrah was in the world was going to be performed differently at every moment of the day. The me in September would probably be different than who I might have been at the beginning of October. But like, the core of who I am was never changing, but I was always going to perform a different version of me based on what I was doing.
Right.
And I think that's what sort of like the athletic shifting, if you will, as I was sort of discovering my likes, my strengths, the things that challenged me, is that like that idea that identity is very, very much performative at its core.
Is that part of the reason why you maybe selected African American Studies as one of your majors as well too? Kind of setting a base, because even whenever you mentioned about whenever you first got to Bowdoin, and it was through a people of color, I guess it was a Black visitation weekend kind of situation. Do you think that added into it, where it was just like, you know, if I set this foundation of a further learning on myself, it also shows kind of what you were saying, the type of person I'm going to be in terms of my environment, and subsequently how I perform on the field, even afterward, or on the track or anything.
I think that is a much more articulate way of talking about something that I didn't recognize was happening at the time. So growing up, being raised by a white mother and being of light skin, I to be honest, there were moments growing up where like race kind of like peppered itself in, like getting picked up from a sleepover and my friend's little sister coming to the door and looking at my mom all wide-eyed and looking at me and then going, "Did you know your mom is white?" And I'd say, "Yeah." You know, and spending most of my childhood growing up with my mom's family and not having a lot of contact with my dad's family, I didn't really think in terms of color until Bowdoin.
Interesting.
And all of a sudden, well, because you get like, so you've got this predominantly white institution,
right,
and you've got a group of people of color, not just Black and African American, but you've got, you know, Latino, Hispanic, Asian students, and you've got like a, you know, call us like a core group, and within that, the experiences are very different. I mean, I think people would like to essentialize like African American experiences like this is what it is, but it's not. It's so much more complicated and complex and layered. And so for me, it just was something that I didn't really think deeply of until I got there. And then all of a sudden it was in my face with, there are a bunch of like racial incidents that had happened on campus, and having an assortment of friends from different backgrounds and different ways that they were existing in the world. All of a sudden it was like this realization that like, I am different than my mom.
Right.
When I go out into the world, people will judge me based on the darkness or lightness of my skin, because, you know, you've got the inner layering that happens within the Black community around colorism.
Right.
And that was happening to me in college. And, you know, I would talk with family members of my friends who would assume, because of the way I enunciated words or spoke, like my grammatical sentence structure, that I was white. I went and visited my best friend for one of our breaks, and she's Puerto Rican. Her grandmother yelled at me the entire break and was angry because I didn't know my language. And no matter how many times we told her I wasn't Puerto Rican, she would not believe it, you know,
What?
and
Understanding me.
yeah. And so all of a sudden it was like, I was having this like identity crisis and awakening that was happening at the same time. And I think that's probably what, without even realizing it, drew me to African American studies.
Right.
And then in the time that I was at Bowdoin, I had three kind of advisors that I worked with really well. Two of them, there was Professor Muther, who was an English professor, but in the time they were there, we had two new professors that came to Bowdoin during my time. And Louis Chudasoke, who was Jamaican,
Mm-hmm.
and very, very visible on campus. Large Rastafarian man who used to, with his dreads, and like he played drum and bass and he DJ'd, and he was an English professor, but the stuff that he taught was like so not canonical, but so important. So I took, eventually he became, I did a project, like independent honors project with him. The first class I remember taking with him was like Black Pulp Fiction. And we read Iceberg Slim's Pimp.
Nice.
Like so, and Cecile Brown, The Love and Lives of Mr. Jive-Ass Nigger. So it was like all of these, like, you know, it's like we watched blaxploitation films,
Right.
we watched Julie Dash, Daughters in the Dust. So all of this stuff that was very, very important, I think, to sort of like the canon of the diaspora, so to speak, within the university system, got brought to this super white trust fund baby kind of school. And it was unbelievably like eye-opening. And, you know, around him, so many different conversations were starting to happen. And then my advisor for African American Studies was Eddie Glaub.
Okay.
And you can, he just had another book that he released. And he is now a professor at Princeton. When he came to Bowdoin, his advisor when he was in grad school was Cornel West.
Wow.
Who came and spoke at our graduation. So like having some like profoundly, you know, intellectually brilliant Black Americans come to a place like Bowdoin and be exposed to them was,
that has to be like revealed on a first time plant, just being able to get that.
Yeah. And at that time I had classmates and then other students who I was really good friends with that were equally like, we're brilliant. And so there were so many conversations happening around identity and politics, because, you know, a lot of the stuff that happens on campuses now where they struggle with like race are not new. Like those things were happening. I mean, we had incidents on campus where, I mean, I had Brunswick police with billy clubs tapping them in my face, telling us that we were in an illegal party, which was in campus housing, but it was the African American students.
Right.
And then they wanted us to disperse. But then when we went outside, you know, more than 3 people is an illegal mob. You know, like things like that.
Right.
I want to say it might have been my sophomore year, kids dressed up like the Ku Klux Klan on our quad, like sheets and all. Wow. And when they got in trouble for it, it was like, oh no, we're cheering to the Cheerio God. Yeah. And like, you know, so there are like little things that are happening. I don't say little to take away from them, but there's a history of it. And these things, like, they are not new to this moment.
Right.
Like, it is so systemically interwoven into the fabric of everything that is America, that it's just like yeah, like sadly, you know, when I talk to my athletes at the Mount and stuff is happening, and even things that are happening out in the world right now, the, like, you know, it's kind of gives you this like heavy moment, because you're like, I'm 43 and your experience isn't all that different than mine was 20 or so years ago.
Right.
Like, where are we?
You know, I find that interesting because I've always, it kind of hit me when I got into my 30s, and I started seeing this constant repetitive pattern. And you'd see it in both innocent and more heavy stuff. Innocently, I would see it in kids' behavior, where I'm like, a lot of these personalities I've literally seen before. Like, I've seen these personalities, the way that they interact. Maybe the external sources are a little bit different, but all the little nuances tend to repeat themselves. Then, of course, we know it in obviously heavier ones like you explained when it comes to either racial or social or anything like that. And I started kind of thinking that maybe it's not so much a factor of it just, well, like you said, it becomes something that's interwoven. It's not so much a factor of not knowing because the knowledge has always been there. You read a little bit, and the same thing that happens now has happened 20 years ago, that happened 40 years ago, that happened 60 years ago, so on and so forth. And it almost run within the same level of pattern. It's almost like the wave that we have now almost seems very reminiscent to the wave of the late 70s, the late 60s to early to mid 70s of where blaxploitation started to go up, and we start to see that increase. And then the 80s, everything kind of came to a little bit of maybe a plateau. And then the 90s, we kind of shook, and it, whatever was hiding, whether it's economy, whether it just information dispersion, but you kind of see these same elements. And I always wonder if it's just the factor that with every new generation, you have to, if you don't implement context, it becomes a repeat regardless of what the knowledge is there or whether it's not there.
I feel like time is cyclical, and therefore so is history. And I think that to sort of break the current cycle that we're on, you actually have to put a break in the shape in the circle, right, to be able to move the flow into another direction. But we lack consistency around education, around the narrative.
Right.
And history is also perspective. And generally speaking, those who hold power are the perspective that is writing history.
Absolutely.
So, history is not, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but history is not absolute.
Right.
Because it is perspective, and it is also tied to memory. So if the person in power is controlling the timeline and the perspective through which events are viewed, defined, explained, memorialized, then that's the context that you're going to have. And we have not had a moment in the world, period, in particular in the US, where that group whose perspective is in power has been different.
Right.
So, right, I think if you overlay all of these moments, it's the same pattern repeating itself. And that's just talking about sort of what's happening here. But I think that's very much true about the world in general, because if you go outside of our present moment, you'll see these patterns are continuing to happen, and the players are different.
Right.
The landscape is different, but the core of what is happening, it is not.
Right.
And I mean, that is everywhere. And
that was, like I said, it's the interesting consistency of human nature, despite the fact that there is, because I think then you get into those instances where you have the books and the knowledge that explain these other sides sometimes, and you're like, oh, if I had known this changes a complete dynamic of how even culture gets played out. I think for me, even one, and to this subject was always, I think the Colfax Rebellion in Louisiana, where after whenever Reconstruction was happening and freed slaves kicked in, and you start to see an influx of Black congressional people in positions of power in the South. And it gets to a point where, obviously white locals end up rebelling against this government body and killing off all these guys in Louisiana. And you also see it in Georgia. And the point that I'm making on that is that you almost remove that component of history from what's being taught normally within schools. And it creates a narrative of slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, everything that we have issue. And then there's no point where an excellence had occurred within this Black community. It just seems to be a constant range of suffering, as opposed to maybe more intentional act of subjugation that occurred. And if you add that little bit of learning inside there, it changes from a cultural standpoint. Hey, this hasn't just been a suffering instance that only was started whenever, slavery occurred. And the only time that there was a resonance of positive was post-slavery, pre-slavery. But it was, even afterwards, there was an economic boon. That's not just one element of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. There was a legitimate economic bloom within a culture. And now it makes it so that people aren't just, they're just incapable, and being able to play that narrative over and over and over again. And that goes into everybody's mindset, regardless of either side of the spectrum. You're either fighting against it or you're establishing it. But one way or another, it changes that whole concept where it goes, okay, these were intentional acts. Now our intentions can make a difference even more so. And I think maybe that's what we get to see a little bit now. And that's where you talk about like those little shape changes in the cyclicalness of history.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of ellipses, like these historical moments of empty matter, where there are narratives and timelines that are just gone.
Right.
And they're not gone because they're lost. They're gone because someone has made a pointed decision to not allow them to be articulated. And so we exist in the current state that we exist, not, it's not as simple as to say that like it's racism, because it's so much more complicated than that. Because racism is, we are in this, and 3D, I don't even think does a good enough job of describing like the matrix that we are in. But you've got race, religion, culture, gender, sexuality, all of these things, economics, geography, everything is kind of like twisting in on itself, and we lack education.
Right.
Because we have these really succinct black spots, like black holes of information, black holes of where full stories and narratives about people, about culture, about time, about development have just kind of like sucked away into this abyss of non-memory.
Right.
People truly can't make informed decisions because we aren't informed. As a world, we are not informed because somebody has taken it upon themselves to say that this systemic system of absolute power needs to
impose itself.
It needs to be protected and shielded. And the only way to do that is to misinform the public.
Right.
Because if you can misinform the public, then you can control them without controlling them.
Right.
And if you look at like, communities of poverty, they lack the ability to take care of themselves, healthcare, and then they lack access to education. Lack of education, lack of knowledge produces a version of ignorance, which means that you are malleable. Right. You can be controlled without someone actually having to physically put their hands on you and put you somewhere.
Right.
Not giving you full picture, you can't decision make. It's a
self-generating poison, if you want to call it like that. It's a self-generating poison, which is why we always get those concepts of generational social depression, to say the least, because of that fact. And you're right. Not just even you're right, but in full agreement. Like it's an interesting. It is probably one of the most interesting dynamics of human marketing and disinformation for that you could see in all history, because it is so big yet so subtle, and it becomes so thought processed into it, where you're going like you said, using schools. People always go, oh man, why do people always complain about schools? You have the same opportunity as me. There's a chance to go to school. And then, at least within the US, you talk about, man, property taxes are what pay for schools. That's an insane concept. So that means the moment that your property value drops, it's not just, oh, your house is less valuable or your building, your real estate is less valuable. You have simultaneously devalued the entire knowledge population that revolves around that area. And that is a massive concept, where when you realize how much that little bit grows, especially from early youth development, and how much we play that in education, in psychological behavior, in nurturing, in one way or another, that leads to our adult lives. And it's wild. Again, it is a marketing that is probably the most impressive that one could see, but not necessarily in the great way, not in a good way.
No.
Yeah. So.
I mean, people are conditioned to, how would I say it? Modern society conditions people to be incapable of understanding like an existence outside of where their feet currently are. Right. It's like a warped, they talk about how most Americans don't travel outside of the country.
Right.
Don't leave their state. Don't leave more than
20-mile radius of where they live.
Yeah. And that is almost like, I feel like it is like a bigger way to explain sort of what happens to us, why people are incapable of having what everyone likes to call courageous conversations. Mm-hmm. How do I have a courageous conversation about something that I literally cannot envision, that I can't articulate it, because in my mind it doesn't exist, because I've been misinformed and conditioned from the very moment I came into being to be in the world in the way that I am, and to see the world, as it exists. It's like it's like a chessboard with super glue on it. Right. So when you look out, things are fixed. What do you mean this is wrong? Right. This is what it's been like for me my entire life. And this isn't any different than what my parents saw. And so you just kind of get this cycle of like fixed misinformation that creates this sense that like we have this really unintelligible population, and that's not necessarily true. Right. If you remove access and you condition people to be misinformed and miseducated, where's the room for growth and change?
Exactly. And it actually kind of brings me to the point, and I'm going to end up circling back to rugby, but it's one of the reasons why I've always felt that I've felt really good about what rugby is capable of doing and what its potential. So an example kind of came in. So I went to a tournament in Vietnam a couple of years back, and I went again recently. And I remember whenever I first always heard about Vietnam, you hear it through the history books because of the Vietnam War, any movies of Vietnam War. So in the best of my mind, I was assuming, man, this place is a war-torn country. It's just everybody's trying to get their little bit of economic development, but we know how long it takes for things to recover. And so I had the opportunity of going, and my brother had told me a little bit about it, where he said like, oh, people are vacationing there. And again, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, people are sectioning off these areas and maybe there's this, but everywhere else is kind of in mess. But then you get there, and I get there and it's just like, oh my gosh, like I get to Saigon. It's like, this is a thriving area. Like this is an area where it's nothing like what I thought of Vietnam prior to, because there's no context for me to have understood Vietnam to be anything else except for what I saw in Rambo movies, what I heard about in the history books. And, and there wasn't an innate curiosity to be like, oh, let me look at this random Southeast Asian country that I heard about in war. So you get there and I'm just like, this place is amazing. I'm like, wait. These people don't hate us? Like, wait, let me understand what is happening over here. And you get this chance, and it's like opening up a new eye and giving you another perspective on how you see this world. And this is even, for me, I've traveled most of my life. My family's from Nigeria originally, so at least even going over there, which was also in and of itself its own eye-opening experience from traveling as a kid and traveling as an adult. But it leads to that point that you make of people, if you prevent access from occurring, people aren't able to change their narrative, their paradigm of the world. And I've always found interesting that within the rugby concept, that if you are speaking within a certain specific culture that seems to resonate at the core of it, where everywhere there's at least this similar element, but then we're just adding these cultural factors, that rugby can be a driver that goes for that. Having been in it for a while, and I know we could have gone more into the talking about where you started, but frankly, I love this conversation far more than what could have been. But kind of within your experience, like when you started traveling out with rugby, how did that even impact the way that you started seeing the world, and subsequently how it led to the way that you kind of perceive how you present rugby to others?
That's an interesting one because, initially my first travel outside of the country with rugby was in grad school with my women's club team, and we went to Europe, went to England, and our tour was like the Ugly American, like Wild West tour. Just gonna leave that there. Okay? Like, yeah. So, there's a reason why when Americans travel, people are not necessarily excited when we're in groups.
Right.
We're easy to find.
Yes.
Culturally, we stick out. We are loud. We are know-it-alls.
Right. We're very upfront. Yeah. There's not that humble couth that comes.
No. Yes, correct. We are not smooth. So like, and that was like my first like rugby tour, and typical of rugby in like the early 2000s. I was like I went to my first US camp, so it was a lot of rugby and partying. Like, right. That was like the international experience was like, and and I look back on that, and outside of the fact that I was like in a different country, I don't know how much of it was different than the experience I was having at home in terms of like play games, and then you go in social and you hang out and you're going out to clubs and to out to eat at like the local pub.
Right.
I think, and for me it's like really hard, I think, to even kind of like wrap my mind around any of that stuff with my travel with the national team, because I think that it's not until later years that like I really think about the lack of diversity that was in the game at that time. Mm-hmm. The US team has changed a great deal, so we have a lot more diversity in our both our men and women's programs, the 7s and the 15s. And I look at my time, which was early on, and there weren't, and there still isn't a lot, but there weren't very many early on faces of color.
Right.
And I didn't like, it's just kind of like growing up, it's like one of those things you're thinking about it, but you're not thinking about it at the
Right.
same
It's
time.
in existence, but it's not intentional in the front of your mind. It's just
Yeah.
kind of like Satan. That middle part, just enough for awareness, but not enough
Yeah.
for
It's
you
like,
to concentrate on it.
it's like percolating, but it hasn't quite hit boil.
Right.
And, and I think that moment for me is why, like, even given what is currently going on, I mean, our country is being ripped apart at the seams by so much disinformation and people's lack of ability to articulate and acknowledge that there's a lot that needs to be changed. And it's hard to change things when people aren't educated around that change. And so
Right.
I'm trying to be more acutely aware of my place within the fabric of rugby as a female of color,
Right.
in a way that I really cannot or can't give myself credit for being nuanced about that in my time in the jersey. And I think when you talk about like moments about travel, actually, I think that I think the big one for me was I volunteered for, well, it's not travel, but this is what started it. I volunteered for World Cup sevens.
Okay.
And, I feel like to kind of be well-rounded, because my ultimate goal eventually is to head coach a national team, like an adult national team.
Right.
And on that list of big bucket items is to become an assistant and eventually a head coach of a professional team outside of the U.S.
Okay.
Because I think that, to me, going and head coaching as a woman in like Super 15, it would be huge.
It's a game changer, such plus a
Yeah,
platform.
yeah. Like I just like kind of like on like different levels. So that's like a bucket list big item for me.
Right.
And I would like for that to happen, or for a woman to do that.
Right.
So, I've been on a national team staff. I assistant coach for Pete Steinbergen for the 2014 cycle. And then when that cycle was over, I was what we called the High School All-Americans at the time, but essentially is our US U18, U16 girls program. And I did that for 2 years. So I was like, okay, like let's kind of experience this from a different perspective, like what it's like to be in this high performance environment. So I signed up to be a volunteer for World Cup. Well, they didn't know what to do with me at first.
What do you mean?
Because as a volunteer for World Cup, for like a team liaison, I bring a different experience than I think, having like a grassroots rugby person come, because I'm a former international player,
Right.
former international level coach. So, I brought the perspective of, I kind of understand what players are wanting, the sort of like expectations that are around them, maybe not specific to sevens, but like in that environment.
Yeah, right.
And then sort of like the pressures that, coaches are kind of under in that kind of like high performance environment around like player welfare, staff welfare, and all of those things. So there was like a lot of back and forth about whether they were going to sign me up as a team liaison or have me work in competitions or someplace else. So eventually they were like, well, we're going to have you be a team liaison. And they said, we're going to pair you with the Zimbabwe men.
Okay.
And I was like, cool. Most amazing experience I've had in rugby. So that was eye-opening for me in a sense, because as a union, they have so little.
Right. Yeah.
And
tight.
And
so
just, yeah. And they're still able to, and with so little support, what they are capable of doing. And a really young team,
right.
Lots of energy, so much joy and gratefulness around playing. It was just like, if I had needed a kickstart to falling back in love with the game, like that was it. Every time we got in the vans and we drove somewhere, the singing in the song, and and that commitment across the board to the idea of them as a family, their family at home. And at home was not necessarily just like like familial family, but it was everybody. It was the supporters, it was the staff, it was the union, and like just that strong connection and around like that kind of like that identity, and just the humility around being at a World Cup.
Right.
And you know, the lack of ego that existed in those athletes, you know, so like that was just like, was amazing. And then you get to the jersey ceremony, and I've been to a bunch of them. I've like, you know, I've had the jerseys presented to me.
Right.
I've been to a World Cup ring for one of those. Like I've handed the jersey for a test match when we had our first test match for the US U18 girls. So they're doing theirs, and you know, like I'm honored to be able to be in the room, because it's a big moment, you know, and they've got guys on the team who this is going to be their first World Cup. So they get to the two last jerseys, and their team manager starts talking about me, and like you're like listening, but you're in this moment. So like
you just
all of a sudden
it.
Yeah, and all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, he's talking about me. And you know, I'd never probably really thought of myself as like really being engaged and giving back to the game. And because it's just like rugby is just a part of who I am,
right?
And so I'm trying to stay involved for like forever.
Right.
So you know, the manager is talking and thanking me for, you know, being there, and that they're honored to have me as their team liaison, because you know, I understand sacrifice to be at a World Cup and what it takes in terms of like, you know, your preparation, all of those things, and that, you know, I'm retired from playing, but I'm still involved in giving to the game.
Right.
And they let me give 2 jerseys.
Wow.
So I handed 2 players their first World Cup jersey, and I just was like, holy shit, like this is huge. And it's probably the next biggest moment to the first time I put my jersey on was handing that to them. And then that was such an amazing experience for me. I was like, there's so much to learn to being a part of this environment without being a player or a coach to take away. So I applied to be a volunteer for Cape Town Sevens.
Yeah.
And you have your 6 degrees of separation. So it turned out that the women's club coach for the team that I was playing, but now I'm not, affiliated with here in Maryland, his brother is a media manager for Saru. And so he just directly connected me. We talked, and I went over and got to work in media, which is a whole different kind of experience, a way to see the international game.
Right.
And that was just amazing, because I got to go on the field and watch the Stormers practice while I was there. I met Sia Khaleesi, and that was such an amazing experience. He is a genuine, humbling human being, like just was awesome. Like he was in a full conversation with their team manager, and my guide walked me in to introduce me to everybody, and he stopped talking, stood up, took his hat off, came around the desk to shake my hand and introduce himself to me. Like,
that's awesome.
You know, just,
the full respect of the moment. It's just
And the crazy thing is, you know, the first thought I had was, this wouldn't happen in the States.
Right. But that goes back to that culture that has developed over time to be able to establish itself in, and has set itself apart from what is just the standard foundation that goes across the board.
Yeah. And then you talk about like the experiences in America and traveling abroad. So Cape Town was my first time anywhere in Africa.
Okay.
We are not going to talk. We will save talking about my mom's reaction to that trip at a later date, because that was pretty amusing and then not amusing. But the crazy thing is when I got there, like, I mean, in the mall, the mall guards have like machine guns, because and You know, my friend I stayed.
Military police kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and my friend that I stayed with has cars like bulletproof glass, and in his driver's side door there's a gun. You know, I just was like, immediately,
Wild.
like, am I gonna am I gonna be okay? And I'm a runner, so the two things is so when we went out to where my friend, he and his wife took me to where his parents live, and we went out there so I could kind of be near the beach because they live in Strand.
Right.
And the first thing I did was go out and run. I was like, yeah, sweet. Like, I'm running along the ocean in South Africa. This is
beautiful.
Fucking amazing. Yeah.
Wait.
And it was like some kind of.
Oh, no, I was going to say, before you continue on that, well, I guess you might be explaining it, but like that realization that you were in Africa, this positional place that America does not speak very highly of in
No.
any sense, in most majority sense of the way. Did it just feel that much more surreal as you were running on it? Just like there's this
I think that like the part of it that was surreal I was going to talk about as well is when I meet people, the first question they would ask me is, did you think you were going to be in the bush? And I'd like awkwardly laugh and be like, no. And then they would go on to say, well, that's what Americans think Africa is.
Right.
The bush. And like, you know, I just kind of was, and it wasn't like just one or two people. I got asked that a lot.
Yeah.
A super, very, it was like a frequent question.
It's like a base question.
Like, yeah. And it was like, and you know, kind of was like awkward and then just really eye-opening because we don't, you know, flash back to my sophomore year of college and sitting in like a lecture hall for like an intro to sociology class, and they're talking about AIDS and Ebola, and someone in the class says, well, Africa, like, I'm trying to remember exactly how it is because these are these moments that like they stick with you forever, but like memory, you know, as we get older, memory kind of like warps the words. But it was something along the lines of like, well, Africa's a dark continent because AIDS and Ebola, that's where they're from. And like and you're just sitting there and you're like, this is the stuff that breeds violence, because this really large intro to Soc textbook that I have could become a weapon of mass destruction, because that's such an ignorant thing to say. But then you go back to our conversation that we're having now about misinformation and access to information. So that white male student exists in this country, in the US, with privilege.
Right.
Privilege because he's male, and privilege because he's white. But that same privilege affords him with misinformation that he doesn't ever have to question.
Right. Well, you know, it's even interesting in that, especially within that topic. Again, like I said, my family is originally from Nigeria, so we always went back, especially younger. And it wasn't until, honestly, recently I realized how much of a privilege that was. To like, we always knew it was a good thing because it connected us with our family, but you don't realize how much it sets the standard on how you understand everything moving forward. So, you know, as a kid who was Nigerian and I lived in State College in Pennsylvania and Iowa, so we're not exactly the most diverse areas in the world. So
no, not at all.
You know, so and even whenever I came to Louisiana and we still had that pervasive thought process, you're always getting asked these questions. Oh man, what is Africa? I remember, you know, Africa's this disease place. Oh, everybody's poor. And then you get those stupid commercials on TV of, you know, the Christian whatever fund. And you just see the skinny kid with the bloated bellies. And it's just like confirmation. And I'll even add to this. Like I said, went there as a kid, went there up until 99, didn't get to go again until 2012. That concept, despite having the knowledge, still ended up playing into our mindset of that location because of what our surroundings were. So when we went back in 2012, I remember my brother and I going like, man, you know, it's going to be tough. I don't know if we're going to be able to move the way that we want to. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. And what, you know, it was just like, we're not going to have the same modern effects, essentially was what we were saying. We're not going to have the same modern effects. And then we get to Nigeria and it was just like, why did we allow ourselves to get caught up in this mythos, this negative mythos of this continent? Because as a kid, we might not have had the awareness simply because, you know, we were kids. It's just, it is, but we're not recognizing all the surroundings. We just know family. Hey, we go to the village, we go see our uncles, see our aunts or grandparents, blah, 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 blah. But then as an adult, as you become much more capable of processing the information, it's like, no, this place is as good as any. Don't get me wrong. Its problems are very real, but its problems are far less foreign than any other place. It just might be a little bit more emblemated because there's just a longer history that goes along with it. The issues are far deeper rooted than it is on just this level of, oh, these Africans are poor, these Nigerians are poor. It's like, no, they're not poor. Like they're really the money there. It's not a broken behind the world place. It's very much there. It's just there's this element of access, misinformation that resonates within the country itself and impactfully resonates outside the area itself and affects that internal working. And it shows us how powerful that messaging can be, that even for us who experienced it firsthand can still be thrown off until having to re-experience it again. You know, so it becomes surreal in and of itself. And the next time I go, it's probably going to still be maybe not as surreal because I don't have the lack of respect for it, but it becomes even more appreciated. I guess maybe it might be the proper thought process.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I've only had that one trip to Cape Town, but I think that you articulate really well. Every place has its issues, and oftentimes they are tied to socioeconomics,
right?
Which is further complicated by other things. So, like, you have the whole continent of Africa around socioeconomics is still to this day probably dealing with trickle-down effects from colonialism,
right?
Very much like we are. And like
right.
you said, like it's a much longer history of having to sort of deal with the aftermath of everything that sort of like seeped itself into. You talk about systemic issues. It's it's no different than it is here.
Right.
There is poverty in Africa. There is poverty in the US, and they are, how they manifest themselves visually is different because we're different geographies, we're different countries with, like our access points to certain things are different, but poverty is poverty.
Right.
And, and I also probably was a bit guilty of that there, driving down the highway and, going into downtown Cape Town from Goodtown and seeing the shanties along the highway. And even traveling with I coached at Gonzaga High School for a long time, which is a all-boy Jesuit school in DC that takes their players on tour every year. And, being in Argentina and driving on the highway and seeing their version of shanty towns. And I remember seeing, it was like we're on the highway going into downtown Cape Town and, seeing the buildings. And the first time we did that, my visceral reaction was just like, wow, that's awful. And then, I then think back to when I first moved to Chicago, and tell me if you remember this movie, Candyman.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Candyman was filmed in Cabrini Green, which is one of the worst projects in Chicago at the time.
Right.
Okay, so, we go to this moment where I'm like, oh, the shantytown, you know, my whole American judgmental self, like, oh God, this is awful. I used to practice in Cabrini Green before they tore that stuff down, and you could not bring bags with you or leave anything by the field or it would be gone.
Right.
There were police patrolling all the time because, I mean, the city of Chicago has a ton of like violence.
Right.
But at that time, like, you know, over the weekend, the number of people, like gang warfare happening, drugs in that area were super high because it was, you know, it was
high.
The projects in America are American shanty towns.
Right.
And like, you know, the kids used to come out with their little like laser beams on the windows and shine them on us in the middle of like practice and stuff. Like someone lost like wheels on their car when we were at practice. And like, what about that is any different than what I saw driving down the highway? There isn't anything.
Exactly.
But it's because we have this perception that it's in Africa, that it's got to be so much worse than what we have.
Right.
Because they're uneducated and they're poor, and that's no different than it is here.
Right.
And, you know, and it's funny because like I stayed with my friend and his wife, and they're white South Africans, so they're Afrikaners. And, you know, I think they were so afraid that I was going to come in as an American and
kind of shake your
this
finger
idea. No, I think it was more like they had this idea that like I'm untouchable because I'm American, because I think oftentimes that is sort of the attitude that we travel with.
Right.
So I don't think they overplayed it, but there was so much fear in how they explained things to me around like my the safety of my well-being. So when I came home and talked about going out and running, people would literally look at me like, you went running by yourself? And I said, well, yeah. I was like, I always ran when someone was at the house.
Right.
And, you know, in their neighborhood, they kind of walked me a loop and said that they would prefer that I kind of like stayed within these parameters.
Right.
Which is like understandable.
Makes sense.
It's a foreign country.
Yeah.
I'm a female running by myself. I was like, cool. And like, I mean, it's no different than going around my neighborhood here. Like people,
but familiar territory.
Catcall and stuff. Yeah. So, but I mean, the first time I talked about that, like the sheer look of terror on someone's face that I, Farrah Douglas, a female, all by myself, went running in Cape Town, and I ran in the city too. Yeah. Like, I mean, why would I not? The temperature is beautiful. It's like gorgeous. Like, so yeah, I ran in downtown Cape Town out to the water and ran along the water. And when I was in Strand, I did. I freaked them out there because like the front gate goes out to the main road, which is like on the, you know, goes along the beach, because it's like a gated community. But the back gate, if you go out and you go, I think it was like takes you down the road to a shanty town, and like somebody had been hurt, like, and when I say hurt, they got stabbed and their phone got taken away. But then, like, that's all. Yeah, but that's also like, I mean, that, excuse the expression, but that shit happens here because it, like, if you run around oblivious, carrying things of value and just have them open, you stand out. Right. You stand out. And there are always, the world is full of haves and have-nots. Right. And if the haves run around holding their stuff,
put a target.
Yeah, like, and as much as you would like to say that, like, that is not true, like, if you systematically deny people access to things, they will rebel and take it when they can. Right.
No, I agree. I remember, I mean, even now, you know, I remember whenever I used to do like door-to-door sales, right? And I used to do it in Miami, in what would be Zion City, which was arguably, I guess, from the 90s and early 2000s, one of the more dangerous project areas of Miami. And I'd always been warned about it, But it was just like, hey, look, we're just going to go and we're going to see what happens. And to be honest with you, I went through, there might have been that initial nervousness, but I think after a little bit, I just stopped caring. And I literally just went my way. But the thing that stood out to me was I could just go my way. It's people just wanting to live. Now, if it was something where I was just like, and I'm in a suit and tie and stuff like that, of course, and people see me, but they understand what's the situation that's happening. Because people aren't inherently like, I'm going to go and get them because they're simply in existence. It's a respect of what the environment sells you. Like, hey, I'm not here trying to flash my money, and I'm not here trying to create attention for myself, or even more importantly, moving with this lost look. There's a systematic method of my movement, and that go back to how it is with anybody with within a certain level of society. You have to move with a certain level of familiarity, even if you're not familiar, because people are not inherently, I don't believe, inherently trying to create evil. It is most likely, on average, let me put that correctly. On average, I do not believe people inherently try and create evil. And even in these low-income areas, it's not we want to get you because you are there. It's if you have crime areas, usually crime exists in terms of rivalry more likely than anything else. And then in terms of essentially positioning yourself as out of place in some way, shape, or form, which comes back to the value, it comes back to the standing out in a major way kind of situation. Yeah. So like to the point that I'm just saying was like what you said. Yeah. Why, like, while it was a foreign area that you were in and that familiarity is not there, you also understand the concept of being in a structure that can be like that. So you know how to properly maneuver and act that might be different, but is not obvious.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, it's very interesting how it all ends up connecting together. Well, look, let me start right, because I could literally sit here and talk to you for like the next 3 hours and just go into this conversation.
That's good.
I'm loving every moment of this. I kind of want to wrap it in because while we didn't go,
I'm also super tangential. Sorry.
Say that again.
I said I'm super tangential.
Oh, you don't know. I love it. And so it while it differed from where it was going to be, it went into an even more positive and honestly an even more interesting conversation that could have been. But I think it ties so well together to everything that's happening. So I'm going to kind of, we're going to compress things a little bit. So where you are now, considering your experiences, considering these knowledges, this understanding of identity being a very big factor in your performance, how does it consistently project itself from you in how you teach your rugby players and how you've been teaching rugby players moving forward? Because obviously whenever you are showing, it's more than just what's going to happen on the field. You're doing as much off the field as it does impact on the field. So for you, how do these all kind of present themselves into how you project the way that you present rugby out?
I think in terms of how I present rugby out, it would be getting them to feel free to express who they are within the game. And then the other side of that, which is not directly related to actually like rugby per se, so much as it's about program and culture, is creating a safe space. So, Mount St. Mary's, it's in Emmitsburg, Maryland. It is a predominantly white institution in a very white area. And we are arguably probably one of the most, if not the most diverse team on campus. And I like to pride myself on creating that. I have, we're representative of a variety of states. Over the 4 years I've been there, religion, the diaspora of color, not specific to African diaspora. I mean, we're just diverse. We're diverse around identity politics. And they feel safe and supported. And I think that's the thing that I want to bring, is that this is a place where you can enjoy being an athlete and feel safe and comfortable being in the skin you choose to wear. And in particular at this time, I think it's really important in what's happening in the world to make sure that I continue to build the diversity and color, so that we have that, and that the sport represents what our sport looks like globally, not just here in the US or England, UK, and being supportive of those women, because I remember what it was like to not see a lot of faces like my own. You know, and the first time that we played South African women, and, you know, it was the reverse.
Yeah.
They had, I think, like two white women on that team, and just like, you know, just seeing like literally the reverse of the team that I'm on, and just like being like, wow. And when we hung out with them, so for me, it's about creating that like sisterhood, that family, and just continuing to build diversity that will allow us as a collective group to, one, be ambassadors for what rugby can represent within our community, and then for us individually to go out and represent that in where we exist outside the world. So I have a rising senior, and she wants to be a civil rights lawyer, you know, and I have a young woman who will be graduating early, and the amount of things that she is involved in on campus are amazing. And if I had not met her, she had not come out and walked on to rugby, she would have left the university based on her experience as a young woman of color. And because she met me and joined rugby and had someone advocating and supporting her, she's going to graduate with a degree from our university. And it's like those moments to realize through sport how impactful as a coach, and in particular because I'm a female coach of color and I am the only head coach of color at our university right now. There was a young man who was head coaching our basketball team. He's now at GW, phenomenal human being, and an amazing coach. But, you know, there aren't a lot of, our faces are far and few within, you know, higher level staff positions in the university setting in particular, across the board, whether it's athletics, whether it's administration, whether it's faculty. So the realization I've had over the last probably year and a half, as I've been pressed not directly but indirectly through the young women on my team, is to be a visible force of change and representation, because I've been gifted with my position and afforded the ability to be visible and be a voice that can represent and, you know, also demonstrate that there are opportunities and pathway. You know, I just did an article, just got interviewed because I have 4 current players from Guam on my team, and I have another 2 coming in. And it's not crazy to imagine that you would have a player from Guam, but I will have 6 from what is a small,
it's a very small
island.
place, right?
Yeah. And, you know, and I think, and kind of building that connection to the island and realizing the opportunity that rugby presents everyone. I mean, which is why when Roots developed and they reached out to me, I was like, yes, like I want to play, and I turned in my application for that and was really excited to be a part of that inaugural women's team, is because it affords us opportunity and visibility in a way that allows us to shine not only athletically, but for our intellectual prowess to be articulated in ways that we are often not afforded.
Right.
And, you know, and you look at like the voices that we have developing, Benicia McGee, Phaedra, and, you know, and we're just talking about like in the women's game. And I'm looking at my team, and there are some women that may not go far in terms of their high level rugby, but they are going to be phenomenal advocates of this sport and of people of color because of, you know, because of what they've been afforded in their experience through sports, through rugby here at the university, but in particular, you know, how it intersects with everything else, with their history prior to the moment they stepped on the field, interlaced with being at a predominantly white institution. So I just think that like we're like in such a pivotal moment in our country's history where the cycle can just repeat itself and repeat itself and repeat itself, where, you know, a couple more years down the road, we'll go back to this where everyone's posting and reading books, but real change hasn't happened. Or we can empower these young, powerfully minded individuals to go out and advocate for change, and they don't have to wait till they graduate. Like, and for them to realize that like sports can be a sounding board that will provide them tools to do those things and to give back and create change in their communities. And I think that's what I want them to take away from. And so that is something that I have to do a better job of in terms of like my place within not just the fabric of rugby, but where rugby intersects with like
with life.
Things out. Yeah, with life. And so I've challenged myself going forward to be a better example of how you can be engaged in the world, because I want them to leave having had a phenomenal experience as a student athlete, because it sets you up for success, because you learn a lot of life lessons. But I want them to go out and say, I can be an advocate for whatever it is that's important to me, and know that my voice is going to matter because I will make it matter.
Dude,
so so in my roundabout way, that's kind of like, yeah, that's my thing. And I'm working on that. And like, I'm just big on the diversity piece of things, because like, we're just going to take it all over.
Right.
Kidding, but not.
But no, it really is. It's a process. But the thing is, it's something that you're already doing. Like, just by the nature of you being and the nature of having that awareness sets you up that way, one way or another. And so I would say, in my opinion, you know, I would give you so much credit for what you've already done. And I continue to give credit to where you're going to be going with it and continuing to be able to develop that way, because it's not just from just for people of color, not just for Black people of color, but in general, like you said, it adds such a lift to the rest of the psychology of what happened. And that generational trickle-down effect impacts everything that goes further on from there. So what might seem like still a process and a struggle now might be a hammer and the nail going through for later on, and you're just getting better and better at it each time. So I'm happy, and I'm glad, and I'm thankful that you are part of that process, and for everything you're doing up to this point and continuing on. So where can people find you and find out more information about Mount St. Mary's, about you, or if they have any advice, have any questions that they think you might be able to answer? Because you dropped a lot of knowledge here today, and I'm pretty.
If they have, I would say, so if they have questions around the university itself, we are NCAA, so I would just recommend that they go to our the school's like webpage, and around the sport, like any kind of information they need is there to contact me through that avenue, because that is a compliance issue for me. But But if anybody wants to contact me with questions around some of the stuff that we talked about, they can reach out to you.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I'll
and then
ride the filter through.
Then I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Awesome.
And then you can like connect me, and I'm happy to chat more about these things. It is, you know, I quit grad school, I think like 4 or 5 times for rugby. No regrets, because your body will limit the amount of time that you physically can play at an elite level. That's just science.
Right. Naturally.
But I am a firm believer that your brain, unless you're having medical issues, you can go back to school. You're always capable of learning and bettering yourself from an intellectual standpoint. So when I made those decisions, it was because I knew that at any point in time I could make the decision to go back and continue my learning, which is a process that I'm actually thinking about right now. But I legitimately have, like, I think enough graduate credits in English literature to actually have my PhD. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So I've done, like, one of the things I was super, super interested in is, like, I love the Harlem Renaissance, like Jean Toomer, Kane, one of my favorite books. It is like the Harlem Renaissance answer to Canterbury Tales.
Nice.
Bomb. So I recommend it. It's a quick read, and just, there was a lot happening at that time when you talk about, like, moments of, like, sort of like intellectual growth and development that's happening. Harlem Renaissance was like bomb around a lot of cultural things. But I was super, super, super taxed with thinking about like the idea of passing. So you go back to when I was talking about, like, identity being performative. Nella Larson wrote Quicksand and Passing, and they're both about a female protagonist that can pass for white because they're light enough. And so I had started working on a project around politics of intimacy for women who are passing. So I'm always down for intellectual talk. And that's sort of kind of like, so you talk about those moments where sort of like what you're experiencing in the world, like, interplays into other things, like that fascination with the idea of identity, and then the fascination with passing and the Renaissance, and like Du Bois and the Talented Tenth. All of that comes out of this moment in my life where all of a sudden I realized, wait, homegirl, you are Black. Your mom might be white, but you do not exist in the world as such.
Right.
And you never will. And, like, just kind of like, and all of the sort of like things that came into that moment, because I think until that point, I'd always thought of myself as just Farrah, the student, Farrah, the athlete. And all of a sudden it was like this other layer came onto all that, which is like, now at this moment in my life, I am a female head coach of color, coaching what is still very much a fringe sport in the US as an emerging sport in the NCAA. And, like, what that means in terms of all of the things that I represent and can speak to and advocate for, means that this job, which I'm blessed to have because not very many of us who are in the rugby world can get paid full time to do what we love, means that I carry a lot of responsibility in terms of using this as a platform, and as in, I just don't know how to explain it differently, but, like, it's a platform that I need to make sure that I stay engaged and active on, because it's very easily, you know, I can just, like, sort of like wisp into the, oh, well, I get paid to coach rugby, isn't this so great?
Okay.
Yeah, and easily I could do that, and who would fault me?
Right.
But but it comes more. And I think it's also that realization that, like, how different that first day I walked up to that practice would have been if all of the things that I could possibly put out into the world around our sport that are not necessarily just sport related, if those things were out there in that moment, in that context of my experience, like, what potentially could have been different, and the growth I went through in those 4 years of school. And then you think about high school kids, and, like, how much growth is happening as they're trying to, like, navigate and figure out what version of themselves they are in that moment of like adolescence, where their brain is still developing, they're still learning how their body moves, and how different things could have been if there was a voice with the knowledge I have in my particular experience, which is not the same as someone who might look just like me, but being able to put that out into the world for someone who might just look at me and say, hey, that's kind of, that's sort of like me, and how different that might have been for me growing up and some of the things I experienced around like identity, so to speak. If like my experience I'm having now were something that my younger self would have had access to, like how different, where would I've not struggled so much, and where would I've had more exponential growth with access to certain things,
or just presented differently, because you go back in and not to expand so much, but it's a struggle, but it might have been just a different variation of the struggle, a different set of realizations, a different foundation. So it still all starts from somewhere, but but anyways, to your point, that's why like you said, I've always believed it is a privilege to, if you have been given much or you've worked to be able to acquire much, it becomes a right that you have to do to pass it on. I think it becomes very selfish, especially whenever you're in a position where you have that uniqueness. It becomes extraordinarily selfish. Yes, people can be capable of it, but it seems like you are sullying your right to have been able to get there, instead of being able to roll that same thing down and, like you said, create that representation for maybe that one person that has a similar, and it may be not similar in totality. It's just fractional similarities that make the biggest difference. Farrah, I legitimately, all the way through, thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm definitely we're gonna do this again, because these conversations,
awesome. I've really enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you. So I'm happy to hear that. I'm very happy to hear that. I was here for this. Like I said, I could have gone on for even longer, just because of the fact that we were just starting to scratch the surface of what it is to have this philosophy of putting identity and rugby together. Like, this was great. We're definitely gonna have her back, and it's definitely gonna be worth the listen. There's so much to be able to delve into, and I want to thank Farrah for coming on, spending the time. Like, it meant the most. And guys, like, you guys can check out even more podcasts like that, or with great guests that we've had, such as last week we had Rashad Lipford, the founder of North Carolina A&T, James Brunson, the head coach and director for the North Philadelphia Nomads, who also are featured in the movie The Nomads, found on Amazon, available on Amazon. Matthew Provost of Prairie View A&M, Nicholas Walcott of the Chicago Griffins, Shetta Emba of USA Rugby Women, Ram Eddings of the Grey Wolves and Idaho State Rugby, Charity Williams of Canada Sevens, Saifuddin Safir of Morehouse College, so many, Blaine Scully for USA Rugby, Angie Elena from Switzerland Rugby, known on IG as Elena Angie. And just so many great guests that we've had. As we're getting up to 20 episodes, man. We've only almost gone 20 episodes on this. And every guest we've had has been as informative, as educational, as insightful as you could ask from anybody. And I could not be any more happier. So, guys, check out these other podcasts. We always are bringing in more. We want to be able to make sure that we're showing you that rugby can be more than just a sport. It can be as much a party as it is an opportunity. And we want to make sure that you know the full range that comes across from that, and what it can do, and what it grows, and what it can be made from it, because there's so much from an international, from a domestic standpoint that can be done. And I'm enjoying being able to bring this to you guys. You guys also, please don't forget to drop a review. Please don't forget to let us put like us on our social media, GiftTime Rugby or HBCU Rugby Classic. And definitely, you guys can always check the videos on this on our YouTube page, GiftTime Rugby Network, youtube.com/GiftTime Rugby Network. And you guys can catch all our episodes in terms of video form, as well as any other content that we have, from stories to games to skits and everything in between. So we want to make sure that you are fully getting an experiential view on everything. So guys, thank you so much. And just want to make sure you know that I hope that you are happy. I hope that you are healthy, and know that you are highly favored. And talk to you next time.